In this video, we're going to talk about how to use the STEEL manual. The first thing you're going to notice is that there are a bunch of tabs, 16 of them, plus the miscellaneous and the index at the back. And we're going to use quite a few of them. If you look at the first page when you open it, you're going to see a list of what are on all of those tabs. We're going to primarily use 16, specification and codes, and then we're going to use parts 1 through 6 to help us meet the specification, which will help us meet the building codes. So if we look at part 1, labeled DIM for dimensions and properties, this is where we're going to find all our geometric properties for our cross-sections. So the first few pages just describe the different shapes, what they mean, right? What the difference is between WM, S, and HP shapes that all look like the letter I. And you can read about the differences. And then you get to the tables. First table, table 1.1 is for W shapes. It starts on page 1-12. We have a W44 by 335 at the top, right? Approximately 44 inches deep. D is 44 inches. 335 pounds per foot. And this table goes all the way across from page 112 to 113. So this top row on the next page is still for the W44 by 335, and it tells you moment of inertia and the different X and Y axes and other section properties that we're going to get into later. So if you have the hard copy of this, just be very careful. This table spans from 112 to 113. So make sure you print 2 pages per sheet if you're printing this. Not only to save paper, but for it to be easier to read. So you have all your different section sizes in here. If you go to the GEN General tab, hopefully yours is easier to open than mine. This is General Design Considerations. So stuff in here is OSHA requirements. You'll see stuff about serviceability, stability, tolerances. So this is how we know how imperfect our members can be for us to actually use them and have them behave how we're designing them. So there's a bunch of information like that. The big thing we're going to get out of this part are the tables. So it's actually easier to hold onto the beam tab and flip to the back of part 2. And we're going to see table 2-4 that we've been using in class already that tells us all our material properties, our yield stress, and our tensile ultimate stress. So you're going to be using table 2.4. You're going to want to tab that. The beam section, right, the one labeled beam, deals with flexural members. We're going to use a bunch of tables in here. One labeled COL for columns will be compression, TEN for tension, COMB for combined forces, bolts for bolts, weld for welds, CONN for connections, shear for shear connections, partially restrained connections, moment connections, brace connections, column base plates and splices, which I'll explain what that is in class, and then other, which is just some odd structural steel members we might design. So sections from bolts to other, we probably aren't going to use in class. We'll talk about connections towards the end. We'll talk about bolts and welds, but we probably won't use the different tables in parts 7 to 15. Part 16 is the big one. So part 16 actually has 3 things in it. Specification for steel buildings, specification for high-strength bolts, which we'll use for our connections, and then the code of standard practice for steel buildings and bridges. So the very first page is our specification. And this specification, so it's part 16, so everything is labeled 16.1-something. Right, this first couple pages are the people who served on the committee to create the specification. Right, these are people who are currently working in practice or academia. Right, I recognize some names from people I've taken courses with as a graduate student. Dr. Fell's advisors listed on here. So there's a bunch of people who have been involved in this over time, and someday you might actually serve on one of these committees that helps write this specification that everybody in practice uses. So if we look at the spec table of contents, everything's listed as a letter chapter. So we have chapters A all the way through N, and we're probably going to use, let's see, we're going to use chapter B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and J. So we're going to skip over I. I is design of composite members. You'll see that in the advanced course. K is for HSS and box sections. Those aren't as commonly used in US practice, so we don't spend a lot of time on them. We have serviceability, fabrication and erection, and quality control issues. Alright, and then you can see some stuff in the appendices. We'll get into some stuff in Appendix 1, maybe, and then Appendix 7 and 8. So we're going to see a bunch of stuff from these chapters. So if you hear a letter attached to a table, it's in the specification. If you hear a number attached to the table, it's in the first 15 sections of this manual. Alright, so for example, everything in Part 1 is labeled 1-something. In Part 2, right, we have Table 2.4. Part 3, we have things labeled Table 3-6. Alright, everything in the specification, if I flip to a table in here, this is going to be labeled B 4.1. So B, it's in Chapter B. So we'll actually use this table later on. So remember, letters are in the specification, number tables are in the first 15 sections of the manual. So if we keep flipping through the table of contents, we get to a very helpful section labeled symbols. So any possible variable you see or hear is going to be listed in this table. So here A sub E, and there's several of them: effective area, effective net area, summation of effective areas, right? And it tells you exactly where this variable is used in the specification. So E 7.2, we're going to go to Chapter E, Section 7.2. If you keep flipping, there's also a bunch of definitions. So if you see a word in here you don't understand, or I say a word you don't understand, you can come to the glossary and look up the definitions. This is the glossary at the front of the specification. It's Part 16. Alright, let's flip to Chapter B. This is design requirements. And if you flip to the second page of it, here's where we see our LRFD equation and our ASD equation. So I didn't pull those out of nowhere, they're in our specification. If you see an equation and you don't understand why you're doing what you're doing or where they're getting this information, you can head to this grayed out area in the manual. This is the commentary. So flip to there. It says commentary for the specification. If I flip to, it's labeled just like the specification, chapters A through N, and the appendices. So if I flip to Chapter B, right here we have general provisions. Here we see load and load combinations, and that's exactly how this is labeled: general provisions, loads and load combinations, design basis. Okay, that should be the next section here, design basis. And this just describes, right, why we're doing LRFD load combinations, where that information came from. So there's references in here. You can see ANSI 1972. So it'll send you to other papers. It'll explain why we as a profession have chosen to do certain things in the specification. So the gray area is very helpful. We'll actually use some equations from there later on as well. Alright, so we've got Chapter B. Chapter C is talking about stability. We'll get to Chapter C when we talk about beam columns. We're going to start off in Chapter D. So we're going to start off talking about yielding strength and fracture strength for our tension members. So it talks about the ways they can fail, gives you the equations for them, talks about how to calculate variables in those equations. Right. There's a table that we're going to use, so you're going to want to tab that one. And it just walks you through how to design these members. So this Chapter D is called Design of Members for Tension. And if we flip back to our Tension tab, you see Part 5 is Design of Members for Tension. So if you look at these equations, This equation is the yield stress times the gross area. This is yielding in the gross section. That's how to calculate P sub n, and it tells you a phi factor of 0.9. If we flip to part 5, the first table tells you yielding, phi pn, and it has the number for you. It's taken the gross area for this section and multiplied it by the yield stress at the top of the page. So it's done this calculation, equation D2-1, for you, and it's done it for every single W section. So everything in part 1 through, well, probably more, 3 through 15 is just taking what's in the specification, plugging and chugging it into the equations with given stress values and different cross-sectional properties. So it's doing a lot of the work for you. So we're going to take advantage of the tables, but ultimately it's always going to come back to the specification, and we can always plug and chug our way through these equations on our own. In the miscellaneous section, you have some conversion factors, you have some geometric property information, and there's also a general nomenclature. So there's an index as well. So again, you can go to the back to try to find the variable you're looking for. You can go to the index to try to find what you're looking for. Could be in the, right, it's all numbered, so 16.1, that tells you it's in the specification. 8-28 tells you it's in part 8. Right, so again, parts are everything here, everything up to the specification. The specification is part 16 and has chapters A through N, as well as appendices 1 through 8, and we'll use appendices 7 and 8 later on. So that is the manual in a nutshell. We're going to start tabbing it up. Right, you need the specification if you're printing the hard copy. That's the separate document. Everything else in the other document is all the stuff in here, parts 1 through 15.